Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's another night and it's another live stream brought to you today with the specific purpose of talking to you about the years known as the War on Terror years. And going to be talking about that with reference to the current events going on in Palestine, because I think it's partially through an understanding of what was done in that period. I think particularly what was done in terms of propaganda, also to justify the mountains of atrocities that went on there, and how that's affected the way in which this particular war is being sold, or that they are attempting to sell it. So first of all, let's start off by checking in with who's in the live chat. So hello to Jay and Banana Bender, Lachlan, hello to Morgan, hello to Roddy, Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, and hello to David Green out there in is that Champaign, Illinois? I didn't know there was a Champaign, Illinois, but glad to have you with us. And good morning to Ash down there in Melbourne, and hello Slava over there in Chicago. Particular thanks to Slava for all the organizational work that she did for the Revolution Report conference I had the privilege of speaking at the other day. That went very well, I hear. So I was glad to appear at that. And hello to Austin. And hello to Beiju. Hello to Mike Martinez. A comment from Morgan. Will be interesting seeing what media figures will walk back their comments regarding the conduct of Hamas. They only had a brief window to believe the worst and make a statement, but they didn't hesitate. No, they didn't, because this is exactly why I wanted to talk about the War on Terror period tonight with reference to what's going on at the moment. It's not just the War on Terror period that creates this atmosphere, but I think this is the background that we have to understand if we're going to properly analyze the situation. But I want to start off before we go any further because I saw online a particularly ridiculous statement from that ridiculous fraud of an individual known as Jake Sullivan, this sort of watery buffoon with these attempts at appearing serious. He was making the rather bizarre assertion that they keep making, and they have done for decades now, that the US and Israel and the NATO countries don't deliberately target civilians. Well, Benjamin Netanyahu is doing his absolute best to prove that assertion wrong right now. You can't escape that. And that's why Sullivan is looking a little more ill than usual. And it's why the reactionaries and the government ministers are calling for censorship. It's why the EU is threatening Musk with more measures against him in a legal sense if he doesn't censor X or Twitter more to take off anything that counteracts the official narrative on the war in Palestine. And the assertion of Sullivan brought me right back to, into a rage, to be quite honest, because you have to ask the question, how many times can the US or Britain or Israel, but let's concentrate on the US and the British for now. You can throw in France and the other NATO countries as well. How many times can the US imperialist bloc, shall we say, blow up a wedding party and pretend that they thought it was a bunch of guys preparing to launch some kind of assault? How many times can they shoot down people in the street when they were occupying Afghanistan or occupying Iraq? How many times does it come out, does it have to come out that some special forces squad or another, be they British, American or Australian, had a clear mandate to execute people who were suspected of being terrorists? How many times do we have to see the video released by WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, known as the collateral murder video, when the scum that were piloting that helicopter gunship, because that's what they are scum, decided that they were going to open fire on all those unarmed people in that square in Baghdad. How many times do we have to see that before we have to reach the conclusion that not only do they target civilians from time to time, they target them deliberately? And let's go further back if we really want to get into this. The British government always made this argument when it came to its own colonial wars, but there was a colonial war waged here in this country and, of course, mostly in Ireland, where the British government did, mostly via its proxies in the loyalist paramilitaries, they did deliberately target civilians all the time. Even official British government investigations found significant levels of collusion between the British state forces and the loyalist terror gangs who did target civilians deliberately. They didn't use aerial bombardment, but they would if they could. But they used just as efficient methods of killing: the bullet, the blade, or the bomb. And you want to go back even further. The conduct of the CIA, the US Special Forces, and indeed all of the US forces in its wars in Vietnam or Korea was nothing but the deliberate targeting of civilians. So let's bring it right back up to date, though, and talk purely about the events in the last 20 years, because the apologists will now be saying, oh yes, well, that was Vietnam. We don't do the Phoenix program anymore. But they do. They absolutely do. The Phoenix program, if you're not aware of it, was a gigantic program of terror and assassination. And again, it didn't start in Vietnam. It didn't end in Vietnam. It rolled right over into the events around Operation Condor in the Southern American and Central American states. It was what was done in Nicaragua, a war of pure terror, again, run by the Central Intelligence Agency. It couldn't have been run without them. That was designed to terrorize civilians by engaging in acts of mass murder and brutality. So, but again, let's bring it up to date. Let's take it into the war on terror period. 90% of the drone targets that, good old Barry Obama was good at approving, that the 90% of the targets that they chose were wrong. They weren't even the people that they were supposed to be looking for. There's countless stories of course, the torture chambers that the US ran in Iraq and in Afghanistan and all over the world, where they would black bag people, bundle them off, and torture them, sometimes to death. And often these were people who'd just been sold to them by some warlord or another. Does that count as deliberately targeting civilians? So this is a lie. This is just, it's an insane lie, because it's one that can be just proven wrong. Even as recently as, I believe it was 2018 or 2017, there was an ongoing court battle between the Obama administration. It must have been pre-2017, I think. And Médecins Sans Frontières, who was suing the US government because the US Air Force blew up one of their medical centers in Afghanistan in I think it was a double tap hit, where they bombed it, then came back to bomb it again. So, and it was clearly marked on the US government's maps. It was clearly marked as a medical center run by a very well-known and very mainline medical NGO. They blew it up. Why? Because that's what they do. Because the imperialist wars are based not on like surgical targeting or anything like that. They're based on terror. The Israelis are just a little bit more open about it than the US and the British are, but this is what has always been the case. Their wars are not based on anymore, certainly, direct conquest of territory quite a lot of the time. And because they don't like holding on to it, it's rather costly. So they prefer to wage their wars through pure terror. What is the sanctions program? The sanctions programs that they've been perfecting over the years, but the application of terror through starvation to civilian populations, through starvation, through deprivation of medicine, through deprivation of the essentials of life. What is that but the deliberate targeting of civilians? How is starving somebody to death any more civilized than shooting them? How is that morally superior? Has anybody explained this? No, they haven't, because they can't. It's the insane lack of analysis done on this claim by the bourgeois press, who never want to analyze this. They never want to dig into it. They never want to question these people too much. And of course, occasionally somebody breaks through, like Max Blumenthal will occasionally get to ask a question at a press conference, and then they'll make sure he never gets back in again. But the reason why this ridiculous claim that is so provably wrong, because they keep having to say, like occasionally after the, I think it was some British special forces went on a kill rampage in Afghanistan because these guys were like presumably pumped up too much and decided to just go completely rogue to the point where they got too embarrassing even for the British commanders. Occasionally, when that happens and it gets out, they'll hang some grunt who went too crazy out to dry. They'll sentence some like sergeant or corporal to 20 years in prison for carrying out what are in effect the orders of the high command, or at least putting them into practice. But this is how they fight their wars. It's a combination of so-called low-intensity warfare, which is sanctions to the point of mass starvation, or it's, if it gets deadly, like it did in Iraq and Afghanistan, it is the deliberate targeting of civilians, and it's a deliberate tactic because it's there to terrorize the population into submission. That's why Israel does it. That's why the US does it. That's why the British have always done it. That's why Churchill was in favor of using poison gas on rebellious Kurds. It's why he was in favor of using mass bombing campaigns of the early Royal Air Force to pacify Afghanistan back in the late 1900s. This is what it's always been like. The imperialists have to systematically apply mass terror in order to pacify populations or buy themselves some time to carry on their exploitation of the country, or literally bleed the resistance to their domination of a particular country dry. That's how they wage their wars. And they have to deny it, of course. I mean, they didn't used to bother denying it like 200 years ago, 150 years ago even. But as time went on and the literacy of the domestic population rose and people started reading newspapers and people started getting the vote, they had to construct more and more elaborate pieces of propaganda to justify what they were doing. Of course, the biggest one of all is, oh, well, we're bringing civilization. And if they don't accept our wonderful civilization, we'll kill every last one of them, of course. But to return to the way which I promised that this particular episode would go, which is talking specifically about the so-called war on terror. Now, this coincides directly with when I became politically active for the first time, which is after, of course, the events of September the 11th, 2001, when the global war on terror was declared, which is always just bizarre to think that this was such a gigantic event, and it was such obvious propaganda at the time that I couldn't quite believe that anybody fell for it. But what it was, of course, using the events of September the 11th, 2001, and other things that went on, they were building a case for a long planned for intervention in the Middle East. They had various plans on the go in the 1990s as to how they were going to secure the great gift that Gorbachev and the Soviet revisionists had given them by collapsing the Soviet Union and collapsing the center of resistance to imperialism. Gorbachev and then Yeltsin had given them this great opportunity to solidify themselves for another 100 years. That's why, Bill Kristol's project was called Project for the New American Century. He wasn't joking about that. They were looking for ways to secure another 100 years of domination. Because, of course, as we've covered before on this program, they were looking for ways to secure the hyper-exploitation of resources and labor in order to revive the system, which was already in trouble from the middle part of the 1960s onwards. Again, you cannot underestimate how great a gift Gorbachev and the Soviet revisionists gave to an imperialist system that was already deep into the mud by that stage. So Kristall and the others, they plan for some kind of establishment of a new American empire. Now, in the 90s, of course, as Putin has long commented on, and incidentally, the commentary I'm going to do on Putin's Valdai speech, that'll be on Patreon tomorrow now. But they tried fucking around in the Caucasus, in Chechnya and Dagestan in the 1990s. That didn't quite work out the way they wanted it to. It nearly came off, but Yeltsin was disempowered and then removed before they could fully press home their advantages there. And the Russian state in the end proved too durable. So they, of course, had another plan, which is that they were going to go and knock out everybody who remained from the Cold War period who was in any way aligned with the USSR, and they largely collapsed, or who had been non-aligned or tried to align with both sides, because that is, of course, what Yugoslavia was. It is, of course, what the Ba'ath Party in Iraq were, and various other survivors from that period as well, Gaddafi being one of them, the Syrian government being one of them. So the plan of the Project for the New American Century crowd, headed by Kristall, but with a long list of adherents, wasn't too radically different from that which the Clinton administration was trying out in the 90s anyway, which is trying to find ways to further assert this new period of US hegemony. And the plan that to go after Iraq and as a means of securing domination over the entire Middle East, that was, of course, one that they were very, very keen on. Partly because, of course, Iraq had already been weakened, as David Green notes in the comments there, by over a decade of sanctions. And, of course, they'd been through the Iran-Iraq war from 80 to 88 as well. And this was a very weakened state. It was a place that couldn't really withstand a full US assault, though I've seen arguments, for instance, quite well-made arguments on some of the Maoist critiques of the war, that the Iraqi army, if it had been organized better, could have done a better job of resisting, but now's not the time to get into that. But they calculated, as it turned out correctly, that they could knock over a very weakened Iraqi army fairly quickly. And it's worth noting that even in that, they had to pause at certain stages because they were running out of supplies. They were outrunning their supply lines. Had the Iraqi army not been so weakened and poorly led, quite honestly, then that might have been turned into a much more difficult encounter for them. They just about got away with it, as it turns out. But their plan, of course, was, and I'm sure many of you will have seen this many times over, the plan, of course, was that they were going to knock down Saddam Hussein, they were going to take over Iraq, and then they would rapidly either do the rest of the countries via military conquest, or they would prefer through the color revolution method, I think. That people would see what they'd done in Iraq, and that it would give great inspiration to the militant comprador forces that they were fostering in Syria and Iran and Libya and other places, all those other places on the cherished list that they had. Now, of course, to do this, you need an effective set of propaganda to justify everything that you're doing, particularly if you're directly invading places. Color revolutions are the preferred method in many ways because even though the outcome is a little bit less predictable, it enables you to hide behind the curtain more. But a direct invasion requires an awful lot of propaganda. And so propaganda is what they, of course, frenziedly engaged in as soon as they were able to pin the blame on bin Laden for September the 11th, 2001. And they go on from there to adopt basically a deeply racist media and propaganda paradigm for the next, well, uninterruptedly really, that was all designed to justify the brutishness of the invasion of Iraq. Now remember, they did two things when over the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. They, of course, come up with a new version of the old lines about bringing civilization to the barbarians, because that's all the propaganda before the invasion of an occupation of Afghanistan was about. It was all about, oh, we're going in to save the women. I mean, that lie is no more convincing coming from George W. Bush than it did from Lord Canning. I think he was the last viceroy of India who administered the Indian colony on behalf of the British East India Company. It's no more convincing coming out of the mouth of Dick Cheney than it is coming out of the mouth of like Winston Churchill or Lloyd George. They've replaced like Anglicanism with human rights doctrine, but it's the same argument. It's almost exactly the same. We need to save the women. We need to save the religious minorities. We need to save this, that, or the other. It's a grotesque lie when you consider, of course, that the protectorates and puppet states of the US empire are some of the biggest centers for global human trafficking, organ trafficking, trafficking of women and children for the purposes of prostitution, gun running as well, the trafficking of narcotics. Kosovo is, of course, a gigantic center for organized crime, as is Israel. Israel is a ruinously corrupt place, and it is a center of organized crime operations, as I've said before, particularly for like Russian-Israeli mafia operations that really took off there in the 1990s with the waves of post-Soviet migration. It's a very corrupt place. It's a very exploitative place for particularly trafficked women. And it's a place with, of course, a ludicrously corrupt political class. And Kosovo is like a small Balkan Muslim version of that, essentially. And they wanted to turn Ukraine into the same thing. Look at how many women get forced into prostitution when they get either forced out of Ukraine or forced to go into prostitution if they stay in Ukraine. The fate of Kosovo is the fate of Ukraine on a much bigger scale. So the point I am making here is that their claim over this being this great civilizing power was a grotesque lie in 1850. It's a grotesque lie in 2001 based on just a look at the culture inside the imperialist countries and the culture of the puppet states. I mean, how many stories did we have to see about even US personnel in Afghanistan actually being so disgusted with the people that the US was relying on to govern the place for them, the various warlords, and their teenage boy sex slaves. I remember at least one US officer was arrested by the MPs and shipped out of the country because he violently objected to it. That's who the US and the British, by the way, were relying on to govern Afghanistan for them. It wasn't Hamid Karzai or Ashraf Ghani. The men that were actually doing the dirty work on the ground with these warlord characters who were narcotics barons, pimps, users and abusers of both boys and girls and women, like the most disgusting, rotten, reactionary filth you could possibly imagine. That's who they were allied with. And of course, on top of that, they routinely carried out massacres of often quite a lot of women. So the claim, I mean, all of this is not only documented, it's documented even in the press of the imperialist countries themselves. But the thing you'll find if you ever get in a row, which I'm sure most of you in the comments have, either online or in real life, with somebody who might admit this, but will still cling to Jake Sullivan's and others' excuse that, well, we don't do it deliberately. They're just bad apples. It's like the old argument about the Metropolitan Police or the New York Police Department when they find some cop in there who's like a rapist or some other horrific criminal, and it's like, oh well, he's just a bad apple, No, it's the institution. It's not this individual or that individual. It's the culture that this system creates. And if your job as a soldier in an occupying army is to essentially make sure that that occupying army keeps control so that the country that you're working for can hyper exploit the resources of that country and the people of that country, then your job is to essentially put down rebellion as violently as possible. And so if that's your job, then is it any wonder that even people who go in who might not be psychopaths when they start basically are when they finish? Or they get psychologically broken because of the horrendous things that they've done and end up having to spend the next 20 to 30 years, or sometimes the rest of their lives, in and out of psychiatric hospitals because they can't handle the memories that they've got, burned into their minds. And is it any wonder then that the US had to continually relax its recruitment criterion because it was having a recruitment crisis? People didn't want to sign up for this kind of thing. And when this was even after the attacks of 9/11, there was a brief flurry. American comrades can correct me if I'm wrong. There was a brief flurry, an upturn in recruitment after 9/11, but it didn't last too long. As soon as things got nasty in Iraq, it dropped right off again, and they had to carry out what they call stop loss on people, which is basically stop people rotating out of Iraq, cancel their extend their tours of duty, extending the tours of duty of like National Guardsmen, dropping the recruitment standards for the regular army just to fill up the numbers. So is it any wonder that they ended up with more and more criminals, psychopaths, and lunatics in there? Oh, and by the way, as we're doing a sort of tour of imperialist crimes, I mean, check out how many people die in what's chalked up to sometimes accidental deaths, but are fairly obviously murders, US military bases all the way through the year. I will come back on this and do a specific program on it, but there's stories about drug dealing. There's stories about, again, child trafficking, sex trafficking, disputes over drug dealing, soldiers shooting each other, faked suicides. I mean, this is the culture of the army that they've got. There used to be, it's not that much different in the British Army, by the way. There was this phenomenon about 15 years ago of like videos going around and documentaries being made with hushed voiceovers saying, look at the scale of brutality and horror in the Russian army. Look at the way the officers torture their men. Look at the way they feast on each other. Look at these animals. And yeah, the Russian army back then was back in like the late, early to mid 2000s, I think it was the worst time, before significant reforms got pushed through and the conditions of the army improved and the discipline improved under the reforms of the Putin era, where the army was basically run as a sort of private fiefdom by a bunch of very corrupt Russian officers. Well, yeah, back then it was really bad. Imagine if they made an honest documentary about the US or the British armies now. It wouldn't be any better, might even be worse than that which the Russian army was like all those years ago. And as David Green points out in the comments, the American football player Pat Tillman, I'm familiar with his story, but Americans correct me if I'm wrong. He was like a massive NFL star, wasn't he? Like one of the most famous. He signed up to the army. I think didn't he get put in the Green Berets or something just after 9/11? And then he rapidly found out what he was actually doing. He found moral objections to it. He was, I believe, corresponding with Chomsky. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. And then suddenly he gets killed in a friendly fire incident. Now, the way I remember this was that his family were pushing for an investigation for years and years and years because the Pentagon lied about it and said he'd died gloriously in battle. But the more you looked into it, the more it started to look as if somebody deliberately killed him for reasons I'm not familiar enough with the case to comment further on it, but certainly that's the reading I've done on it. It began to look as if somebody in his own unit or some anybody who had taken offence at maybe something that he'd said or something that he'd objected to had decided to off him. So, okay, we've got some comments here. Austin says, see if you can get an interview with Seth Harp. He's a good source on all the shit that goes on at US military bases. Right, I will make a note of the name and come back to it. Daniel from Maryland says, the forested areas around Fort Bragg are well known for having hundreds to thousands of undiscovered graves. Jesus. Yeah, Fort Bragg was the one I heard about. Also Cindy Sheehan. Oh, is Cindy Sheehan still around? Okay. I didn't realize. I forgot about her. She was a massive name in anti-war protesting about 18 years ago, almost 20 years ago. Yeah, Lachlan said Tillman's diary was read the polar opposite of what the State Department was saying. Yeah, didn't. I'll need to go back to this, but I think I'm right. Tillman discovered something about like the way the US was fighting the war, I think, that made him question everything. And after that, he was killed. All right, Cindy Sheehan has a podcast now. Okay, I will make a note to try and look her up then. Okay, but the point here that we're having out of this discussion is, of course, that you look into the culture, or Google if you want some horrible dirt on the British Army, the scandals around the deep cut barracks. There was a series of like men, very young men and women who were told killed themselves in that barracks between like the mid-90s and I believe the late 2000s. And often the ways that they were said to have killed themselves were utterly bizarre. There was one recruit. I mean, this guy was barely like 19. Who was said to have killed himself by putting an SA-80 assault rifle behind his head and pulling the trigger. Now, I'm not too familiar with the way the SA-80 assault rifle handles, never having handled one, and also never having shot anything more deadly than an air rifle. But I know the size of one, and actually if you wanted to kill yourself with an assault rifle, well, the way to do it is not to put it at the back of your head. The guy was killed execution style, basically. And the reason it came out, the deep cut scandal, was because some of the parents kept asking questions and the Ministry of Defence had to eventually have new inquests and have the civilian police get involved. And in the end, they admitted that there'd been systemic failures and, maybe the officers were a bit brutal and that kind of shit. But basically, somebody at that barracks was executing people. That's the British Army, as Luke Kelly once sang, and fuck the British Army, because that's the way they treat a lot of the working class men and women now who join up. If you don't measure up in the eyes of some psychotic sergeant major, then you'd get beaten half to death or killed. And they'll say, I mean, they come up with all this shit now about how the army's too woke. I bet it's fucking not. I bet that what they do is like they'll send some officers on a diversity and inclusion course, but there's no fucking way that the British Army is woke. I mean, these are people who used to put up Jeremy Corbyn's picture on targets for shooting at. It's ridiculous. Thanks to Slava, who's going to share Cindy Sheehan's contact details. Thank you for that. And I'll look up Seth Harp as well. So, reason why we've taken this digression into the internal cultures of the British and US armies is it's pretty fucking obvious that for any problem that the Russian army might have had, or even the Russian army still has to this day, the culture in the British and the US armies is infinitely worse. And again, this comes back to the grounds upon which they operate and the system they are asked to defend. If you're going to be sent off to a foreign country to defend the profit margins of Rio Tinto, British Petroleum, and Lloyd's Bank, or Citibank, ConocoPhillips, and Texaco, or Goldman Sachs, then that is not a particularly noble cause. So, of course, they have to lie to you about why you're going there, and, of course, not a lot of people are actually going to want to do it. So they're already scraping the barrel when it comes to recruits. And then they have to get these people to follow orders without question. So they have to brutalize them, whip them into shape, drive them to battle. And then when they get there and they are asked to do essentially occupation and policing roles, many of them snap, can't handle it, and commit horrible crimes. And that's just assuming that this is accidental. Often, as we've been arguing, it is not. The terror is the point. The terror is used to so-called pacify populations, which takes us, of course, right back to our old friend, the frustrated Austrian watercolor artist. Now, as I've said numerous times before, the big objection that they have about him, well, the two big objections, is that A, he didn't win, and B, he brought into Europe directly all of the tactics that they'd used in British-occupied India, French-occupied Africa, British-occupied Africa. Everything that he did, everything the Nazis did, all had direct precedence in British, French, pre-existing German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese colonial rule, or indeed the way in which, say, the United States pacified the Philippines, or the way in which the United States acted in its colonial wars in places like, well, Mexico back in the day. Wasn't that much different there. The way the US acted repeatedly in Haiti to this day. And by the way, brief digression on Haiti. I've got an interview scheduled with the American independent journalist Dan Cohen for Friday of this week. I had him on the show in podcast form this time last year, to talk about his work on the Haitian leader Jimmy Cherizier. Now, going to have him back on to talk about the US, who are, of course, attempting to send a new colonial force into Haiti with all the accompanying brutality that brings, but with a Kenyan fig leaf in front of them. And they're trying to get the Kenyan compradors to send essentially some riot cops to help them out. So I'm going to be talking to Dan Cohen about that on Friday, and hopefully that'll be out later on in the Friday, this Friday. So to return to the point that we're making about the whole war on terror stuff, like, none of this is particularly new. None of the arguments that they used about civilization needing to be brought to the barbarians, they called it freedom and democracy, but it's an old argument. They dress it up differently. It's the same colonialism, but delivered in slightly different ways for the same purposes. And so how does this link in to what is being done in Palestine today? Well, the relentless demonization of it was principally those of the Muslim faith, of course, following on from 9/11. But I would argue it went deeper than that. It was a demonization campaign against anybody who could be seen as Arab or Central Asian, was portrayed as violent, dangerous, backward, and needing to be quote unquote civilized. And that's not just in government propaganda or media propaganda. I mean, you read not just the usual suspects in Britain, like the Daily Mail or the Sun, but the Guardian as well, no less racialist, no less horrifically pro-colonial in its attitude. And that's before the complete degeneration that the Guardian's gone through since it got raided by Special Branch 10 years ago over the Snowden affair. So the question that we come back to is, of course, well, what does this lead us towards? And again, it was used to justify the invasion of Iraq, but one of the people who was most keen on the whole war on terror was, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu and his predecessor Ariel Sharon. Sharon, of course, made the ludicrous claim that Arafat is our bin Laden. I mean, as I said last night, it sounds ludicrous, but what Sharon was, of course, aiming for with that was he wanted to get complete license, which he got. He was always going to get from the Bush administration to essentially undo the incredibly small, nearly non-existent concessions that had been made to the Palestinians in the 1990s. And he wanted to use, as did Netanyahu, the atmosphere that was being created in the United States, Britain, and the European countries towards the Arab populations of the world, the Arab masses, in order to justify his own campaigns of pogroms and annexations. And this, of course, was magnified through all their friends in the media in Britain and the United States, who will happily justify anything Israel does all day and all night, as we're seeing today. And so we've had 20 years almost of very intense demonization of Arabs and Muslims in particular, but I would say it's anybody who appears to be from that region of the world. That region of the world being anywhere in North Africa, anywhere through, of course, Iran to Iran, in Central Asia. Because, of course, these were the principal targets of the regime change operations, and so all the populations there had to be demonized. Now, the other side of this that I wanted to look at was, of course, the long-term effect of this, because the war on terror period kind of came to a close in terms of its propaganda value for a number of reasons. The Syrian operation turned into a big mess for imperialism because the Syrian government didn't fall apart. It lost a lot of ground to the imperialist auxiliary forces, shall we say, that were being used. Al-Qaeda types, ISIS and others, the moderate rebels and Foreign Legion of President Erdogan. Now, it all goes wrong in Syria, of course, because the Russian government finally decides that enough is enough, and they're not going to tolerate the US essentially killing another one of their allies. Because I think it's pretty much without doubt that if Assad had been defeated, unless he managed to flee to Russia, he would have been killed in roughly the same way Gaddafi was. But the Russians decided finally that they weren't going to allow this to go on any longer, and of course they acted to preserve their ally, along with, of course, Iran and Hezbollah. And this, of course, threw the whole war on terror thing on its head, because suddenly they were in a situation, the American imperialists were, where none of their propaganda was making any sense anymore. They couldn't claim, after doing in Gaddafi and after going after two fairly, well, not religious fundamentalist regimes in the slightest, and they couldn't claim to be fighting religious fundamentalism when even their own officials were admitting that ISIS was on their side in Syria. And then the Russians came in and said they were waging a war on terror. So it all started to fall to pieces thanks to the Russian intervention. Then, of course, you get the Trump crisis, and the whole war on terror rhetoric starts falling apart. But just before it did, we saw some really horrific examples rhetorically of the kind of thing that is being called for now in Gaza. Remember, if you will, another disgusting reactionary, but one who's been reduced to a punchline now. But remember Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz was meant to be one of the front runners back in 2015. Was demolished by Trump along with all the rest of them, and ultimately had to bend the knee to him. But Ted Cruz, in his early debate performances, and I remember watching all these in 2015 to early 2016, he used to routinely call for the carpet bombing. I'm not quite sure he understood what he was on about, of Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. He just kept saying, carpet bomb them, carpet bomb them. And at the time, this was I kind of laughed at it because it just seemed ridiculous. And he kind of then, because he got sort of destroyed by Trump, but Trump made similar, blood-curdling threats. Though Trump, it was always like a sort of bizarre vaudeville show, which made it even weirder. But when I think of Cruz, and Rubio was more boring, but just as psychotic. And yeah, the claims he was making then, the things he was calling for, when I was reading through the psychotic screams of British parliamentarians for the leveling of everywhere in Gaza, I couldn't help but recall Ted Cruz and the way he said he was going to win the war on terror And the way they said that they were going to fight this to the end by just carpet bombing them all, which again, it makes no sense other than just as a sheer raw exercise in brutality. And then this brings us back, of course, to our discussion of Gaza and Palestine today, which is that when you see all these people, there was Kevork Almasian was tweeting about some CDU politician in Germany screaming to end Gaza, and he said, "Well, this is genocidal language," and she sort of caught herself and said, "No, I meant in its current state." Well, what does that mean? And this is why, of course, I object and will continue to object to this characterization of this war as Hamas versus Israel. Now, I see a lot of people, including people on the left, whose opinions and other things I might respect, repeating this idiocy. It's not, as I said before, Hamas versus Israel. That is like an Israeli propaganda point. It is, of course, far more groups than just Hamas who are involved in this joint command that they've got going. It is, of course, far more than Hamas who back this operation. Hamas has the backing, clearly, of the masses in Gaza. They wouldn't be able to do it if they didn't. And, of course, as we covered last night, they actually won the election that was held when the US was urging the Palestinian Authority to hold elections. So they have the backing of the masses of the population. So it is not a case of Hamas versus Israel. If you're repeating that, whether you know it or not, you are doing Netanyahu's work for him. You are allowing this to be boiled down to a question of a so-called terrorist group versus Israel. And you are, wittingly or otherwise, playing into the divisions placed in the discourse by the war on terror rhetoric. And you are doing the work for Netanyahu and Biden of justifying the response that the Israeli state is doing right now to Gaza. The carpet bombing that foul creatures like Ted Cruz called for is what, of course, Netanyahu is unleashing now. And if you're boiling this down to Hamas versus Israel, not only are you factually wrong, but you are doing propaganda for Israel. Now, I don't mind saying that to anybody, even people who supposedly agree with me. But people have got this, especially Americans and some British as well, British people as well. They've got this like war on terror brain. They've absorbed all this propaganda about terrorism so much that it's distorted all of their political judgments. It's a triumph of bourgeois propaganda, and people need to get it out of their heads. And this is why, ultimately, is this one of the reasons why that what's being called for in response to the Palestinian military operation is essentially mass murder. What is being called for by all these politicians, like that ridiculous twat in the House of Commons, Tom Tugendhat, or the more refined way they're calling for it, which is how Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer saying, "We back Israel no matter what." Well, what does no matter what mean? What it means is no matter how many Palestinian children or how many Palestinian lives in general that Netanyahu feels it necessary to claim to recover his manhood in front of Israel, in front of the Israeli population, no matter how many deaths it takes, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and the United States and Canada will back Netanyahu up. That's what no matter what means. And so to see Biden babbling away with Kamala swaying gently behind him like she just had a quarter of a pint of rum, and Blinken looking like he just had a lemon enema given to him, saying, "No one can take advantage of this. We're with Israel." Well, they're full square behind Israel, more so than at any point before, more violently than any point before, because, of course, and this is partly what explains the sheer psychopathic rage pouring out of the politicians and their hired pens in the media, is because, of course, they know they're losing in Ukraine badly. That's going down the tubes. And if Israel, their unsinkable aircraft carrier, to quote General Alexander Haig, an unfortunate semi-namesake of mine, if that goes down to defeat or is seen to be defeated, then that is another blow directly against them. Now, many of these people in the press corps of the bourgeois press and the bourgeois politicians, particularly the more overtly reactionary ones, they are psychotically invested in Israel. They are invested in it to a point where you can only understand it if you can recall, as I can, just about the response of like the similar types of people to like Irish republicanism back in the day. I can remember, like, because I grew up in the early 90s is when my first real coherent memories start. Cause I was 10 in 1992, and I can remember like the latter period of the IRA campaigns and the INLA campaigns as well. And I can remember like the psychotic rages that you would see in the newspapers and on television, and from like relatives and like your friends' dads. You didn't really understand it when you're 10 years old, but like the rage that it would put the reactionaries in when the IRA did something, particularly when the IRA hit like a military target or something like that, that would actually make them more enraged than when there was any civilian deaths. And by the way, it was always the loyalists that deliberately targeted civilians, which need to keep throwing that one in there. But I didn't really understand it at the time. But of course, you come to understand it when you develop more political awareness later on. It's like suddenly the people who they regard as inherently inferior, and the British ruling class still do regard the Irish as inherently inferior, by the way. They still do. You don't need to go too far or get a bourgeois too drunk to get all of his prejudice flowing out of him. And I'm not talking about like guys in their 60s and their 70s. I'm talking about men my age or younger. As I said on the Telegram group the other day, you haven't experienced real British racism until you've heard it from the mouth of a bourgeois. You haven't experienced like real filthy prejudice. Like, you grow up in Britain, and American comrades can chime in on this as well. I'm sure your experience might be the same, maybe a little bit different. You grow up working class in Britain. You will grow up with a lot of prejudices, probably. In most of our cases, we do. This is what happens when you grow up in an imperialist culture. And I was fortunate in that my parents at least encouraged me to be independent-minded. And that was something that many others didn't have. And you do grow up in a culture soaked in prejudice, where you, as a young working class man, are encouraged to be as ignorant as possible. They don't want you very well educated, after all. And they encourage you, through the culture, through the media, to be as prejudiced as possible towards as many different groups as possible. So I was familiar with the casual prejudices of my background before I went to university. I didn't know anything about prejudice, as it turns out, because if you want to know about that, just listen to a child of the bourgeoisie. These people are just as, I'm assuming that it's no different 20 years later. They're just as repugnantly racialist and disgusting as they would have been in like 1860. Because that's the conversations that I was party to in various different university clubs that I was in. And it was a genuine surprise because you grow up with people using prejudicial language, people telling racist jokes. But I never heard a serious case for eugenics before I went to my university. I never heard people literally claiming the old like racialist pyramid of the races was real before. I never heard so many prejudices towards the Irish as I did at my university. And there was a lot of Irish people there, by the way. And it always came from the same like very upper crust English bourgeois types. They appeared to hate the Irish more than anyone else, actually. And a lot of it does come down to the fact that A, they think the Irish were inferior and that the English should still rule them, but also that the Irish shot back repeatedly and for a long period of time. That still really riled them up. I mean, some of these guys would still get teary-eyed about the death of that old pedo fuck Lord Mountbatten, for instance. So when it comes to like the Arab populations, the Arab masses in the Middle East, I mean, these people are foaming at the mouth, ready to go, ready to see them consigned into the ashes. Now, of course, they can't do that because, as I am fond of pointing out on these programs, they are under a number of constraints, not humanitarian constraints, by the way, but military, political, and economic constraints, because their system is decaying, that prevents them from doing the kind of like horrific massacres that they would like to do. They've still done a lot of horrific stuff, but they can't get away with doing the things that they could have done 150 or 200 years ago. The long-term effects of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and the anti-colonial revolution have made it so that that is a lot more difficult to do. And the system is decaying so that they've got this impotent rage. They can't go and fight the Russians because they know they'd lose. So again, maybe picking up on some of the stuff that Peter's talking about here, the psychoanalytic side of things. So all the impotent rage that I would say that the bourgeois is expressing in their frothing at the mouth desire for Benjamin Netanyahu to go and do a genocide for them by proxy in Gaza, a lot of that is fueled, I think, by the fact that they know that they're on the slide. They know that their time in the sun is coming to an end. They can feel the world changing and it's not in their favor, and they don't know how to make it in their favor. And so the only thing that they've got left now, they know they're losing in Ukraine. They were unable to destroy Russia via sanctions. And, you know, think of how many Russians died in the 90s. And that was the time when, of course, the British bourgeois loved Russia the most, when the Russian bourgeois were destroying their own population on behalf of imperialism. But they failed there. They can't beat up China. I mean, if you want to see an amusing video, look up Chuck Schumer trying to berate the Chinese for their lack of sympathy for Israel. It's remarkable. I mean, he goes there on this bipartisan Senate delegation and then starts shouting at them about Israel. The man's a lunatic. He's that far gone that he can't accept that they're not doing what he says. Me, Chuck Schumer, the king of the Senate, you know. But yes, this comes down to, I think a lot of this is down to the fact that that Israel is their, and has been their, unsinkable aircraft carrier, to use Haig's word again. It's a long-term, over 100-year-long project. It's their last really solid bulwark in the Middle East. All of the other places that they've got troops in, they could be forced out of tomorrow if the population seriously turn on them. And if they carry on down this road to mass slaughter in Gaza, they could risk, of course, the stability of the Kingdom of Jordan. If the king there is seen to be, as he is, too much of an American puppet, it could destabilize his rule to the point where he's chased out of there and has to go into exile in his London townhouse. And it could destabilize the rule of al-Sisi in Egypt. So this is like a expression of, it's a howl of impotent rage. They are losing, and they know they are losing. They know probably on some level, the smarter of them, that Israel is probably going to go down the pan as well. And so the only thing that they have left is trying to slaughter as many people as possible on their way out the door to postpone their fall domestically. And make no mistake, they don't regard, if you're British and you're American or Canadian or Australian, they don't regard us, the working class population, even those of us who think we're better because we've got an education and can put a couple of letters after our names, they don't regard us as any better than those people overseas. They are obliged, and have been obliged by the historic class struggles in our countries, to not make us go up chimneys from the age of 6 anymore. They're obliged to have been obliged to make concessions, which they're desperate to take back. They can't just come out into the open and declare that everybody who doesn't earn at least £1 million a year is scum to be disposed of anymore. They do say that in private, by the way. But they regard the working class population of Britain as completely disposable, as is the case in the United States. I think most of the working class in Britain and America probably understands that about their rulers. The people who don't understand that are the Labour aristocracy and the Dumbo petty bourgeois who still think they're something special. But we'll find that as they go on the slide further, they won't be any more merciful towards us than they are towards the Palestinians in the end. And the sooner everybody realizes that, the sooner everybody realizes that they do not regard us as anything other than disposable commodities, whatever decency that we are treated with is a result of them having to make concessions over the years. There is nothing that they would like better than to restore the rule that they had in place in 1815, where they were hanging people for stealing a loaf of bread. Again, they can't do that, and that's part of what makes them mad so much. So we are approaching now the point where, because imperialism is on the slide, because it is losing ground everywhere, because it has so far been unable to revive itself in a serious way, they are going to go on the assault against the working class domestically in a very serious way. And this, at that point, we will see the war get brought home to us, more so than it is already. And so if you, and I don't think anybody watching the stream will have these prejudices, but if any of us harbour any illusions about the way the ruling class will treat us, that they will treat us in the end any differently to the subjugated populations overseas, that they would not do to us what they want Benjamin Netanyahu to do to the people of Gaza if they feel their rule is threatened by us, then drop those illusions right now. Read the true history of the British and American ruling classes, and you'll see people who will be remembered in the future right up there alongside the failed Austrian watercolour artist. Because they're no better than him, ultimately. They have been constrained more due to the Bolshevik Revolution, due to the strength of the domestic working class, but all imperialist ruling classes ultimately have the streak of fascism a mile wide in them. And, you know, to quote an old phrase, scratch a liberal, find a fascist, well, that's undeniable. Just look at the way they behave right now towards Gaza. Ultimately, that is the way they'll behave towards all of us when the system finally crashes into the rocks. Right. Time to go back and look over the comments. Okay, right. Morgan says they used Pat Tillman's image for a pro-military display at a Super Bowl, if I recall. Yeah, it's very Starship Troopers, isn't it? Jesus. Beiju says, yes, but it's all freedom and democracy, those good old Western values. Yes, that and other fairy tales. Nazis, Big Meanie says, Nazis use Manifest Destiny as a rationale for Lebensraum. That's correct. Also, I think Austin's commenting on the genocidal way the US defeated the Native Americans. Okay. Junior Cadiz is looking forward to the discussion with Dan Cohen. Well, as am I. Daniel from Maryland says, speaking of Haiti, I love how every political formation that develops organically there are referred to as gangs in the media. Yep, just as every Palestinian political formation has always been referred to as terrorists. Doesn't matter whether it's Hamas or the PFLP or any of the PLO umbrella groups. It's always the same. Austin says, Sikhs and other South Asians faced a lot of racism in the US after 9/11 because some people thought they were Arabs or Muslims. Some were even killed. Yeah, racism is always stupid on top of everything else. Karen says, or anyone from an oil-producing country, quite correct. Peter says, a psychoanalytic thought. When predatory imperialists disguise vengeful or opportunist wars of plunder with high morality, wait for the deranged cruelty of its disavowal secret super-ego supplement. That's a good point. This is venturing into the territory of Freud and Lacan there, but perhaps there's no harm in doing so. Perhaps this is something we should visit again in the future. Beiju says, I remember the mute response from the mainstream media when ISIS was defeated in Syria. Yeah, ISIS were there, guys. ISIS could fight the war in a way that the imperialists couldn't. The way that ISIS fights wars is the way the imperialists wish they could fight wars. That's why they invented ISIS. And as John Kerry said, ISIS is acting in our interests in Syria. That's as close to an admission as you're ever going to get. Right. It is also cancelling the Palestinians, says Karen. Irish Partisan says white phosphorus now being dropped in Gaza. Yes, we saw the pictures of that. They are advocating genocide, says Karen. Yes, they are indeed. Lachlan likes the Bill Clinton impression. Well, perhaps we'll see more of it in the future. I also do a Trump impression as well that I'm working on. Hello to Tusker, who says that she's enjoying the Palestine coverage the last few days. It's been really helpful. Well, glad to be of service. Austin says, I met some RAF guys at a bar in Boise, Idaho, who were here on training back in 2017. They were vehemently anti-IRA when I asked them their thoughts about it, and were drunk in the military and said the military wouldn't let Corbyn be PM. Well, they were at least being honest. I mean, 2017, that's 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and they're still mad about the IRA. How old were those guys, Austin, if you don't mind me asking? Because to even remember, the IRA campaigns, you'd have to be my age, and I'm 41. So, the fact that it still angers them to this day is, well, I'm sure many old IRA men will be probably quite amused by that. Schumer is Big Meanie's senator. Well, my sympathies, mate. Irish Partisan says 12 million Russians died prematurely during the 90s. Mark Ames wrote about it extensively in the Exile magazine. Yeah, that's when the British ruling class liked Russia, when Yeltsin was literally overseeing the mass slaughter of his own population. David Green says the polite distance that liberal American Jews have learned to keep from Israeli bigotry reflects Netanyahu's treatment of Obama and the distance they want to keep from Trump. Yeah, I wonder how much distance is being kept at the moment. But yeah, David's point is certainly correct. The liberals get embarrassed by Netanyahu because he's too crude. He's too honest. I think that's the thing. He's too much of an honest face for Israel. I think the liberals in the United States would prefer somebody who can put a good spin on it. Netanyahu's too crude, too openly racist, and knew that he could basically give Obama the finger because he has Congress on his side and the media. And he knows very well. I mean, Netanyahu understands the relationship between Israel and the United States. He knows very well that he can basically just do whatever the fuck he likes, and periodically he'll have to make some rhetorical concession. But there's absolutely no way that the United States ever abandons the relationship with Israel. He knows that, and that's how he acts accordingly. Hello from Rhode Island, USA, says Steph Lopez. Good to have you with us, Steph. Ash says, have you seen the film Riot Club about the Bullingdon Club? It seemed an extreme film, but now I think it might be accurate. I haven't seen it, but I have met people who are fairly similar. I will add it to the list of things I need to review. By the way, end of the month, Halloween special, going to be reviewing The Exorcist. Tune in for that. Kent says, good afternoon from the US. No country has the right to exist, especially the Zionist entity. Fair point. Lachlan says, what do you think about Sarah Wagenknecht's potential establishing of a new left-wing party in Germany? The Ukraine war was the final straw. I think the German left fall in line. I have my doubts about this for a number of reasons. I have doubts about whether Wagenknecht has the necessary organization or political backbone to actually pull this off. Breaking the mold in German politics. I mean, Germany, if you read what's going on there, is even more repressive and extreme than Britain is, which is really saying quite something. So is she and are her supporters ready for the level of heat that's going to come her way? Because it'll be far more directed at her than directed at the AfD. The AfD will eventually do a deal with the CDU. I'm convinced of this. They'll eventually sign a load of documents saying they love NATO and they love the EU and they love Israel and we hate Russia and can we have less immigration, please? And they'll go into a coalition with a more overtly right-wing CDU government. That's what I think will happen. Establishing like a genuinely separatist, or a breakaway left force is going to attract a lot more hostility and a lot more heat. It'll attract a lot of enthusiasm potentially as well, but is Wagenknecht ready for that? Are the people behind this ready for that? I'm not sure. And I'm saying I'm not sure because I genuinely don't know. I need to read more on it. I'll try and get a German comrade on to discuss it in more depth before I comment further. Kent says, also thank you for exposing the embarrassing analysis of people like Brian Berletich. Well, sometimes Brian Berletich's analysis is right. I think when it comes to like analyzing like the military side of things, I think he's done really good work. Politically, though, disastrous, as goes for many people, to be honest. Okay, so David Green says Rabin got killed. Well, yes, Rabin being, of course, Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister in the 90s, who I believe, David can correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Netanyahu sailing very close to calling for his assassination? Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong about that. Ash says, I just watched Exorcist and the recent Believer film. My God, you watched that thing? Looking forward to this review. I was surprised at how political it was. Are you talking about the Believer film or the original? Karen says, you are right to be doubtful about Wagenknecht. Okay. Banana Bender says the left party in Germany is struggling to even poll at 5% these days. Laughable. Well, I remember them being as high as 12 to 15% when I was in Germany last for an extended period of time. That was a while ago now. It's 14 years ago. So they were going places. I know Wagenknecht blames it on basically like the petty bourgeois left went completely berserk and just alienated all the working class. But again, I'll have to look at it. So, right, I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening. I think the discussion's kind of gone all over the place, but I hope that comrades have gained some knowledge out of it. Thank you to everybody who's contributed to the chat again. So that's Jay, Banana Bender, Lachlan, Morgan, Roddy, Irish Partisan, David Green, Ash, Slava, Austin, Beju, Mike Martinez, Burke, Ian, Red Star Betty, Ben Cavana, my comrade from the CPGBML, Karen Mendes, Klavek, Peter, Junior Cadiz, and Daniel from Maryland, and Kent, and my comrade Beju, Big Meanie, commiserations about Chuck Schumer, by the way. Yeah, Blumenthal has said that Netanyahu was in favor of Rabin's death. Okay, yeah. I knew I heard it from somewhere. And Ash says it was the original Exorcist. Yeah, well, there is a degree of politics in that. Both there's a lot of subtext in it. The book's very interesting as well, considering that William Peter Blatty, the writer of it, was a absolutely foaming at the mouth like Catholic reactionary. It's actually a very good book, very well written. The Ninth Configuration is also a very good film, and as is Exorcist 3, by the way, another film that again came from Blatty himself, who directed it. So as always, a reactionary, which Blatty undoubtedly was, can create very great pieces of art. So going to be doing that on October 31st, just to have it traditional. Right. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. The audio of this will be going straight up on Patreon. So I will be back with you again soon. Until then, see you later.
Fideli, Because